Some bullets change everything, not because of who they kill, but because of what they reveal. Deep in the Colombian mountains, where the jungle swallows secrets and the rain never stops washing away the past, Carlos Mendoza polished glasses behind a bar that had become both his sanctuary and his prison. For 15 years, he'd served aguardiente to farmers and forgotten soldiers, men who understood that some stories were better left buried. But tonight, as lightning split the sky and thunder shook the cantina's wooden walls, a young woman walked through his door, and Carlos knew immediately that his past had finally found him. She moved like a dancer, ordered like a tourist, but her eyes swept the room like a predator. When she reached for something beneath her jacket, Carlos didn't hesitate. His old reflexes kicked in, and the Colt .45 he'd kept hidden under the bar found its way into his trembling hands. One shot. She fell, but in the ringing silence that followed, something impossible happened. A child's music box began to play, its haunting melody drifting up from her belongings like a ghost from his murdered past. How could a dead daughter's lullaby lead an assassin to his door? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The melody stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the drumming of rain against the cantina's tin roof and Carlos's ragged breathing. His hands shook as he kept the Colt trained on the motionless figure behind the bar, though every instinct screamed that the threat was over. She lay crumpled against the wooden shelves, her dark hair fanned across bottles of cheap rum like spilled ink. Fur Elise, the same 17 notes his 5-year-old daughter Sophia used to hum while braiding her doll's hair. The same melody that had been playing in her room when the car bomb turned their Medellin home into a crater of twisted metal and shattered dreams. Carlos forced himself to move, his bare feet silent on the cantina's worn floorboards. The woman's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, alive but unconscious. Blood seeped from her shoulder where his bullet had found its mark, mixing with the perpetual dampness that clung to everything in these mountains. He should call Dr. Herrera, should tend to the wound, should do any number of things a decent man would do. Instead, he knelt beside her and searched for the source of that impossible melody. Her leather satchel had spilled open when she fell, its contents scattered like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. A medical kit, props for her nurse cover story, a bus ticket from Bogotá dated 3 days ago, false identification papers bearing the name Elena Vasquez, and there, half hidden beneath a manila envelope, a small music box with a broken ballerina frozen mid-pirouette. Carlos's vision blurred. This music box was identical to the one he'd bought Sophia for her 5th birthday, the one that had been destroyed along with everything else he'd loved. With trembling fingers he wound the mechanism and listened as those haunting notes filled the cantina again. Each chime was a knife twisting in his chest, each pause between notes a reminder of 15 years spent trying to forget. The envelope beneath it bore his name in careful script, Carlos Antonio Mendoza. Not the name he'd given the villagers. Here he was simply Carlos the bartender, the quiet man who'd arrived one day during the worst of the violence and never left. But this envelope knew who he really was, who he'd been. Thunder crashed overhead, and Carlos realized he was crying. When had that started? He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and tore open the envelope with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. Inside was a single sheet of paper and something else. Something that made his heart stop completely. A gold locket, tarnished with age, bearing the tiny scratches and dents he remembered from watching Sophia wear it every day of her short life. The locket his wife Maria had given her, passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter in an unbroken chain that was supposed to last forever. The letter was brief, written in a woman's careful handwriting. Carlos, she is alive. They both are. Find me where the jaguar sleeps beneath the emerald crown, where you promised Maria you would take her for their wedding anniversary. Come alone, trust no one else. The debts of the past are calling, but redemption is still possible. A friend. The words swam before his eyes. She is alive. They both are. Sophia and Maria, his wife, his daughter, his entire world, supposedly buried in the cemetery outside Medellin 15 years ago. He'd stood in the rain at their funeral, watched their coffins lowered into the ground, while cartel soldiers kept their distance, and even Pablo's enemies offered condolences. The bomb had been meant for him, punishment for the one time he'd refused an order, the one moment he'd chosen family over duty. Or so he'd believed. Carlos clutched the locket until its edges cut into his palm. The inscription on the back was still visible, though worn: "Para Sofía, mi pequeña estrella." For Sofia, my little star. He'd watched Maria engrave those words herself, had held Sofia while she giggled at the scratching sounds the tool made against the gold. The woman, Elena, stirred behind him, a soft moan escaping her lips. Carlos shoved the letter and locket into his pocket and turned his attention back to the present. She'd been hired to bring him this message, not to kill him. But hired by whom? And why now, after 15 years of silence? In the distance, the village church bell tolled midnight, its bronze voice carrying across the sleeping houses where decent people dreamed of crops and weather and simple problems. Carlos envied them their ordinary nightmares. His own had just crawled out of the grave and demanded to be fed. He needed to stop Elena's bleeding, needed to get answers, needed to understand how a ghost from his past had found him in this forgotten corner of the world. But first, he needed to accept the impossible truth that everything he'd believed about the worst day of his life might have been a lie. The music box sat silent on the floor between them, its broken ballerina waiting for someone to wind her back to life. Carlos pressed a bar towel against Elena's shoulder wound, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of a man who'd dressed bullet holes before. The bleeding was slowing. He'd hit muscle and bone but missed the major arteries. She'd lived to answer his questions, assuming he could resist the urge to finish what instinct had started. The locket burned against his chest where he'd tucked it beneath his shirt. "Para Sofía, mi pequeña estrella." How many times had he traced those words in his dreams? How many nights had he lain awake in the small room above the cantina, wondering if he could have saved them, if he'd been faster, smarter, less devoted to a man who collected loyalties like trophies? Thunder rolled across the mountains, and Carlos found himself cataloging the familiar sounds of his refuge: the creak of settling timber, the whisper of wind through coffee plants, the distant lowing of cattle in Joaquin's pasture. 15 years of these sounds, 15 years of building a life from the ashes of his old one. What would it all mean if Maria and Sofia were alive somewhere, waiting for him? Elena's breathing steadied. Carlos bound her shoulder with strips torn from a clean bar towel, then dragged her unconscious form to the storage room behind the bar. He locked the door and pocketed the key. She wouldn't be going anywhere when she woke up, and the thick adobe walls would muffle any sounds she might make. The cantina felt different now, tainted by possibilities he'd buried in a Medellin cemetery. He'd opened this place not as a business venture but as penance, serving drinks to men who carried their own wars in the lines around their eyes, farmers who'd lost sons to guerrillas, shopkeepers who'd paid protection money to 3 different armies, widows who came for cooking wine and stayed for the gentle silence Carlos offered, instead of empty platitudes. He moved through the familiar ritual of closing, washing glasses, wiping tables, counting the modest take from the register. Routine had been his salvation, the steady rhythm of ordinary tasks that kept darker thoughts at bay. Pour drinks, listen to stories, sweep floors, lock up. Sleep when exhaustion finally overwhelmed memory. Wake before dawn to receive supply deliveries and prep for another day of quiet service. Tomorrow, today, now that midnight had passed, would bring the usual cast of characters. Old Papa Vicente would arrive first, ordering black coffee and staring out the window at mountains that reminded him of battles fought a generation ago. The Herrera boys would stop by after morning chores, their hands still smelling of cow and hay, to argue about football and girls with the intensity of young men who'd never had to choose between family and survival. And there would be Carmen. Carlos paused with a glass halfway to the shelf, struck by the realization that he hadn't thought of her once since Elena's arrival. Carmen, who ran the village school and lived alone in the White House with blue shutters. Carmen, who brought him books she ordered from Bogotá and lingered after hours to discuss everything except the carefully unspoken attraction that had been building between them for months. She was 43, a teacher who'd come here 8 years ago after her husband died in a bus accident outside Cali. Like Carlos, She'd arrived wounded and seeking refuge from a world that had taken more than it gave. Unlike Carlos, she'd found peace here. He saw it in the way she laughed with her students, in the careful garden she tended behind her house, in the gentle persistence with which she'd been drawing him out of his self-imposed isolation. Last month, she'd asked him to the harvest festival. He'd made excuses, claimed the cantina needed tending, but she'd seen through his deflection with the patient insight of someone who taught children for a living. "You can't mourn forever, Carlos," she'd said quietly. "Sometimes the dead want us to live." If only she knew how complicated that advice had become. Carlos finished stacking glasses and moved to the window, staring out at the sleeping village. 12 families, maybe 50 people total, counting children and the handful of elderly who'd stayed when the violence drove everyone else away. They'd accepted him without questions because rural Colombia taught you not to dig too deep into anyone's past. Everyone was running from something, but they trusted him now. Joaquin asked his advice about crop rotation. Senora Martinez left her grandson with him when she needed to visit her sister in the valley. Dr. Herrera had offered to teach him basic medical skills, saying the village could use someone with steady hands for emergencies. Small gestures, quiet acceptance, the gradual weaving of a life worth protecting. Carlos had built something here, something clean and honest and purposeful. The kind of life Maria would have approved of, if she'd been dead to approve of anything. The music box sat on the bar where he'd left it, its broken ballerina catching fragments of lamplight. Carlos approached it like a man walking to his own execution, knowing that everything depended on what happened next. He lifted the music box with both hands, cradling it like something sacred and terrible. The weight was wrong, heavier than Sophia's had been, as if grief itself had settled into the mechanism over the years. When he turned it over, his breath caught. Scratched into the base in a child's unsteady hand were 4 letters, S-O-F-I. Sophia had never learned to spell her full name. Carlos set the music box down harder than he intended, and the impact triggered the mechanism. Elise began to play again, each note a hammer blow against the careful walls he'd built around his memories. He thought of Sophia's gap-toothed smile, the way she'd insisted on wearing that locket even to bed, how she'd beg him to wind her music box one more time before sleep. The melody stopped mid-phrase, the ballerina frozen with one arm raised toward heaven. From the storage room came the sound of movement. Elena was waking up. Carlos grabbed the Colt from behind the bar, checked the cylinder out of habit, and unlocked the door. She was sitting against the wall, one hand pressed to her bandaged shoulder, dark eyes alert despite the pain etched across her features. "You're faster than they said you'd be," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, "and more careful. Most men would have killed me. Most men haven't spent 15 years wondering if they should have died instead of their families." Carlos kept the pistol trained on her but didn't chamber around. "Start talking." Elena studied his face in the dim light filtering through the small window. "You read the letter." I read words on paper. Could have been written by anyone, about anything. But even as he said it, Carlos's free hand drifted to the locket beneath his shirt. The music box proves nothing. Sophia's was destroyed with everything else. Was it? Elena shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. Or was it saved by a mother who had 30 seconds to grab what mattered most before the men came to collect the bodies? The cantina seemed to contract around them, the walls pressing closer with each word. Carlos had reconstructed that day 1,000 times, the meeting that had run long, the phone call warning him to stay away from the house, the sirens already wailing as he raced through Medellin's narrow streets. He'd arrived to find smoke still rising from the crater where his home had been. Neighbors gathered in shocked clusters, Maria's sister weeping into her hands. "I saw the bodies," he said, though the words felt like glass in his throat. "Burned, but I identified them myself. You identified what they wanted you to see." Elena's voice carried the weight of practiced revelation, as if she'd delivered impossible truths before. 2 bodies. Female, approximately the right size, in a fire that burned hot enough to melt dental work and obscure faces beyond recognition. Carlos's grip on the pistol tightened. "You're saying Pablo staged their deaths? That he, decided to spare them out of sentiment?" Pablo was already dead by then. This came from higher up, from people who understood that a loyal bodyguard was worth more than 2 corpses. Elena leaned forward, her gaze never leaving his face. They needed you broken but functional, grieving but still capable, a man with nothing left to lose except his own life. The rain had stopped without Carlos noticing, leaving behind the kind of mountain silence that made every heartbeat sound like thunder. Through the small window, he could see the first gray hints of dawn touching the peaks. Soon, the village would wake. Papa Vicente would shuffle down from his shack, expecting coffee and the comfortable routine of morning conversation. The world would demand that Carlos be who he'd been yesterday, the quiet bartender, the man who'd found peace among strangers. "The letter mentioned a place," he said finally, "where the jaguar sleeps beneath the emerald crown." Elena nodded. "You know it?" He did. Laguna Verde, a hidden lake high in the Cordillera, where jade-colored water reflected ancient cecropia trees. He'd promised to take Maria there for their 10th wedding anniversary, a romantic getaway to one of Colombia's secret places. The war had intervened, Pablo's paranoia had grown, and the trip had been postponed indefinitely. It was the kind of detail only family would know, or someone family had told. "How long do I have?" The question surprised him with its certainty, as if his decision had been made the moment he heard those 17 notes. The message was specific. 3 days from when I arrived. That gives you until tomorrow night. Elena struggled to sit up straighter. "Carlos, if I'm lying, you lose nothing but time. If I'm telling the truth..." She didn't need to finish. If she was telling the truth, then every day of the past 15 years had been built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies. Every sunset he'd watched from this cantina, every small kindness he'd accepted from the villagers, every moment of almost peace he'd found in Carmen's smile, all of it would become a betrayal of the family he'd abandoned to grief. But if Maria and Sofia were alive, if they'd been waiting all this time for him to find them, then no price was too high to pay for that reunion. Carlos looked out at his sleeping village, at the life he'd built from the ruins of his old one, and felt it all beginning to slip away like smoke. The gray light of dawn crept across the cantina floor like an accusation, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air between Carlos and everything he thought he knew about his life. He sat at the bar, the music box before him, turning Sofia's locket over in his fingers until the worn gold warmed against his skin. Each revolution brought back another memory. Sofia giggling as she helped him stack glasses, Maria humming while she swept the floor of their old house, the weight of his daughter sleeping on his shoulder during late-night feedings. 15 years of grief, and now this woman in his storage room claimed it had all been theater. From outside came the familiar creak of Papa Vicente's gate. Carlos checked his watch, 6:30, exactly on schedule. In 5 minutes, the old man would shuffle through the cantina door expecting black coffee and the morning ritual of comfortable silence. Carlos had never missed a morning in 8 years. It was the kind of reliability that had earned him a place here, the steady presence that let the villagers trust a man who'd arrived with no past and asked for no future. He could hear Elena moving in the storage room, probably testing her bonds, calculating escape routes with the professional assessment of someone trained to survive. Carlos had tied her wrists to the water pipe, not tight enough to cut circulation, but secure enough to prevent any surprises. The wound would slow her down, and the locked door would contain her until he decided what to do next. If she was lying, he was holding an innocent woman hostage over the delusions of a grief-addled mind. If she was telling the truth, he'd spent 15 years drinking himself to sleep while his family waited for rescue. The cantina's front door opened with its familiar squeal. "Buenos dias, Carlos." Papa Vicente's voice carried the rough warmth of a man who'd been greeting the world the same way for 7 decades. "The coffee smells different today. Did you change suppliers?" Carlos realized he hadn't made coffee. In all his years here, through hangovers and heartbreak and the 1,000 small catastrophes of daily life, he'd never failed to have the pot ready before Vicente arrived. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over while his mind spiraled through possibilities. "Just a different roast," he lied, scooping beans into the grinder. The familiar ritual should have been comforting, but instead felt like play acting. Carlos the bartender performing for an audience that didn't know the show might be ending. Vicente settled onto his usual stool with a grunt. You look like hell, amigo. Too much of your own inventory? If only it were that simple. Carlos worked the grinder, letting the noise fill the space where conversation should be. Through the small window behind the bar, he could see smoke rising from Dr. Herrera's chimney. In another hour, Carmen would walk past on her way to school, probably carrying lesson plans and the patient smile she wore when pretending not to notice his mood. What would he tell her? That he might be leaving, might never come back, might have been living a lie since the day they met? That the quiet man she'd been slowly, carefully falling in love with was actually a killer haunted by ghosts who might not be dead? Elena Vasquez, he said suddenly, testing the name. You know anyone by that name? Vicente scratched his stubbled chin. Can't say I do. Why? Someone asking about you? The old man's eyes sharpened with the alertness of someone who'd survived the violence by learning to read danger in casual questions. Carlos cursed himself for the slip. In a village this small, curiosity was currency, and Vicente was the bank president. Just someone who might pass through, Carlos said, pouring coffee into Vicente's chipped mug. Looking for work, maybe. We could use a proper nurse, Vicente mused. Dr. Herrera's getting too old to handle everything himself. This Elena, she's medical? The lie came easily, built on 15 years of practice. Claims to be. You know how it is with strangers? Vicente nodded sagely and sipped his coffee, apparently satisfied with the explanation. But Carlos caught him studying the cantina with new attention, the scattered chairs that hadn't been properly arranged, the missing towels Carlos had used for Elena's bandages, the faint smell of gunpowder that still lingered despite the mountain air flowing through the windows. Time. That was what Carlos needed most and had least of. Time to think, to plan, to decide if he was brave enough to hope or smart enough to walk away. The letter had given him until tomorrow night, barely 30 hours to choose between the life he'd built and the family he'd mourned. From the storage room came a soft thump, barely audible over Vicente's humming. The old man didn't react, but Carlos felt his chest tighten. Elena was awake and testing her constraints, probably planning her next move with the cold calculation of a professional. Soon she'd start calling out, and then he'd have to explain why he was keeping a wounded woman prisoner in his storage room. The music box sat silent on the bar between them, Sophia's broken ballerina frozen in her endless dance. Carlos covered it with a bar towel before Vicente could ask questions he couldn't answer. Outside, the village was waking up, and Carlos Mendoza was running out of time to decide who he wanted to be when the sun set again. The bar towel seemed to burn against Carlos's palm as he pressed it down over the music box, as if he could smother the questions it raised along with its silent melody. Vicente continued his methodical coffee consumption, occasionally glancing toward the storage room when another soft sound emerged. Elena testing her bonds, probably timing the intervals between each thump to map the morning routine. I need to make a supply run, Carlos said abruptly, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. To Medellin. Vicente's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. In 8 years, Carlos had never traveled further than the Valley Market, never stayed away longer than an afternoon. The old man set down his mug with deliberate care. Medellin's a long way for supplies, amigo. Special order. Can't get it locally. Carlos turned away, ostensibly to wipe down already clean glasses, but really to avoid Vicente's penetrating stare. Might take a few days. The silence stretched between them like a drawn blade. Outside, Carlos could hear Señora Martinez calling her chickens, the Herrera boys arguing over chores, the gentle percussion of village life beginning another day. All of it suddenly felt fragile, temporary, a soap bubble that would burst the moment he stepped beyond these mountains. You planning to come back? Vicente's question carried no judgment, only the weary recognition of someone who'd watched too many good men disappear into their own histories. Carlos met his eyes in the mirror behind the bar. I don't know. It was the most honest thing he'd said in years, maybe decades. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither man wanted to voice. Vicente finished his coffee and stood slowly, joints protesting the mountain chill. The cantine'll need watching while you're gone. Vicente, you don't understand. I understand plenty. The old man's voice carried unexpected steel. I understand a man doesn't spend 8 years pouring drinks in the middle of nowhere unless he's running from something. I understand you never talk about before, never get mail, never mention family. He paused at the door, hand on the frame. I also understand you make the best coffee in 3 provinces, and you've never cheated anyone out of a peso. From the storage room came 3 deliberate knocks, Elena signaling her presence, perhaps testing whether Carlos would acknowledge her existence in front of a witness. Vicente's head tilted slightly at the sound. Rats, Carlos said quickly. Been meaning to set traps. Awful regular for rats. Vicente's smile held no humor, almost like they're trying to communicate. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Carlos could feel his carefully constructed life trembling, ready to collapse under the weight of too many secrets. He thought of Carmen's laugh, of the trust the villagers had placed in him, of the peace he'd found in this forgotten corner of Colombia. All of it would crumble if Vicente decided to investigate the sounds from the storage room. Whatever business you got in Medellin, Vicente said finally, I hope it's worth what you're risking here. He left without another word, the door swinging shut behind him with unusual force. Carlos stood alone in his cantina, surrounded by the ghosts of routine and the specter of choice. Through the window, he watched Vicente walk toward the village center, probably heading to Joaquin's house to share coffee, and carefully worded concerns about their bartender's strange behavior. Carlos retrieved the key from his pocket and unlocked the storage room. Elena sat against the far wall, her bound hands resting in her lap, dark eyes alert despite the pain that tightened the corners of her mouth. She'd managed to work one wrist partially free, not enough to escape, but enough to prove she hadn't given up. Leaving? She asked, as if she'd heard every word through the thick adobe walls. Maybe. Carlos leaned against the doorframe, suddenly exhausted. Tell me something only Maria would know. Something from before Sofia was born, before the bodyguard work. Something private. Elena studied his face for a long moment. She was afraid of butterflies. Carlos felt the world tilt sideways. What? Butterflies terrified her. She said they looked like flying flowers that had torn themselves free from their roots. Elena's voice softened. You used to tease her about it, called her your beautiful coward. She made you promise never to plant a butterfly garden, no matter how pretty other wives said they were. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Maria, at 19, newly married, confessing her inexplicable phobia while they walked through the botanical gardens in Bogotá. How she'd grabbed his arm when a monarch landed on her shoulder. How she'd laughed at her own terror afterward. It wasn't the kind of detail that appeared in files or surveillance reports. It was intimate, absurd, perfectly Maria. Carlos felt something break open inside his chest. Not grief this time, but hope. Terrifying, violent hope that burned away 15 years of careful numbness in a single moment. I'll need supplies, he said quietly. And someone will have to watch the cantina. Elena smiled through her pain. There's no going back after this, Carlos. Once you start looking for them, the people who arranged their disappearance will know. Your quiet life here ends the moment you leave. Carlos looked out at his village one last time, memorizing the simple beauty of a world where Carlos the bartender had found peace. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey to discover if Carlos the father might find his family. Then it ends, he said. The reality of leaving crashed over Carlos like a cold mountain stream. He stood in his storage room doorway, watching Elena massage circulation back into her partially freed wrist, and felt the full weight of what he was about to attempt. 15 years of hiding had made him soft, careful, predictable. The skills that had kept Pablo Escobar alive through 100 assassination attempts were buried beneath layers of bar towels and small-town routine. First lesson, Elena said, reading his hesitation. Trust no one completely, including me. The people who arranged your family's disappearance have had 15 years to plant assets, cultivate sources, prepare for the day you might start asking questions. Carlos thought of Vicente's penetrating stare, of Dr. Herrera's careful questions about his past, of Carmen's patient attempts to draw him into village life. How many of his neighbors were exactly what they seemed, and how many might be something else entirely? You're suggesting my entire life here is surveillance. I'm suggesting you've been successful at hiding because someone wanted you to feel successful at hiding. Elena struggled to her feet, favoring her wounded side. A man consumed by grief doesn't ask inconvenient questions. A man who believes his family is dead doesn't go looking for evidence they might be alive. The implications made Carlos's head spin. If Elena was right, then every sunset he'd watched, every conversation with Vicente, every tentative smile from Carmen had been part of an elaborate theater designed to keep him docile. The village that had become his sanctuary might actually be his prison. "Cut these ropes," Elena said, extending her bound wrists. "If we're doing this, I need to be able to move properly." Carlos hesitated. The moment he freed her, the fragile balance between them would shift. She'd be an ally instead of a prisoner, but also a potential threat with her own mysterious agenda. The knife wound in her side would slow her down, but Elena had already proved she was dangerous even injured. "Your real name," he said. "I need something to call you besides the lie you arrived with." "Elena Vasquez isn't completely a lie. Elena Restrepo. I was born in Cali, trained in Cuba, worked throughout South America." She met his eyes steadily. "And your family saved my life once, though you probably don't remember." "When?" "Bogota, 1982. I was 16, caught in crossfire between DAs and M19 guerrillas. Your wife pulled me into a doorway, shielded me with her own body until the shooting stopped. She was 6 months pregnant with Sofia at the time." Another impossible detail, another fragment of memory that felt too specific to be fabrication. Carlos could picture it, Maria's fierce protectiveness, how she'd risk anything to help a stranger in danger. It was exactly the kind of impulse that had made him love her and constantly fear for her safety. He cut her bonds with his pocket knife. Elena rubbed her wrists, then immediately moved to the small window, studying the village with professional assessment. "We'll need to leave separately. You go first, make your preparations obvious. Let whoever's watching think you're just making an extended supply run. And you? I'll follow tonight, after dark. There's a trail behind the Herrera place that leads to the old mining road. Meet me there at midnight." She turned from the window. "Carlos, the people we're dealing with have resources you can't imagine. Government connections, military assets, networks that span continents. They've kept your family hidden for 15 years because they have the power to keep them hidden forever. Then how do we find them?" Elena smiled, and for the first time, Carlos glimpsed steel beneath her wounded facade. "Because I have resources too. People who owe me favors. Information brokers who trade in impossible secrets. Connections that run deeper than official channels." Her expression darkened. "The question isn't whether we can find them. It's whether they'll be alive when we do." A chill ran down Carlos's spine. In his desperate hope to believe his family had survived, he'd barely considered what 15 years of captivity might have done to them. Maria would be 53 now, Sofia 30. What kind of life had they been forced to live? What kind of psychological toll had their imprisonment extracted? "Time," Elena said, seeming to read his thoughts. "Every day we delay is another day they remain in limbo, another day their captors might decide they're more trouble than they're worth." Carlos nodded, his decision crystallizing into cold determination. He would need weapons, money, transportation. More importantly, he would need to become someone he'd tried to forget, the man who could look into another person's eyes and decide in an instant whether they lived or died. "One more test," he said. "Sofia had a scar, small one, shaped like a crescent moon. Tell me where." Elena smiled sadly. "Behind her left ear, hidden by her hair. She got it falling off her bicycle when she was 7. You blamed yourself for not being there to catch her." Carlos closed his eyes, letting the memory wash over him. His beautiful daughter, brave face streaked with tears, insisting she was fine while he cleaned the wound with trembling hands. When he opened them again, he was no longer Carlos the bartender. He was Carlos Mendoza, and he was going to war. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. 15 years of rust couldn't be scrubbed away in a single moment of resolve. But Carlos felt something fundamental shift inside him as he stared at Elena, her knowing smile confirming details that only Maria could have shared. The careful, measured movements of a man who'd spent years avoiding attention gave way to something sharper, more predatory. I'll need 3 hours, he said, his voice carrying an authority that had been dormant since 1983. Can you stay hidden that long without bleeding to death? Elena pressed her hand against her wounded side, checking the makeshift bandage. I've had worse. But Carlos, she caught his arm as he turned toward the door. The moment you start gathering supplies, start acting differently, they'll know. 15 years of watching you pour drinks and sweep floors, and suddenly you're preparing for war? That sends a signal. She was right, and he cursed himself for not thinking tactically from the beginning. The Carlos who'd protected Escobar would never have made such an amateur mistake. He'd grown soft in ways that could get them both killed before they even left the village. Then I make it look like something else, he said slowly, mind racing through possibilities. Vicente's already suspicious about my Medellin trip. I need a reason that fits the man he thinks he knows. Carlos moved to the cantina's small safe, hidden behind a loose board near the bar. His hands found the combination automatically. Maria's birthday, Sofia's birth year. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth alongside his emergency cash, lay a single photograph, Maria and Sofia at the beach in Cartagena, taken 6 months before the bombing. Their faces were sunbright, unburdened by the violence that would soon tear their world apart. Carmen, he said suddenly. Elena raised an eyebrow. Dr. Herrera mentioned her mother needs surgery in Medellin, expensive procedure the family can't afford. Carlos tucked the photograph into his shirt pocket, feeling its edges against his chest like a talisman. If I suddenly decide to help pay for it, make a grand gesture. He let the implication hang. A man in love does foolish, impulsive things, Elena finished. It explains the urgency, the secrecy about money, the reason you might stay away longer than planned. It was perfect cover, built on enough truth to feel authentic. Carlos had been fighting his feelings for Carmen for months, and half the village had probably noticed. Vicente certainly had. If Carlos suddenly embraced that romance as justification for reckless generosity, it would provide the emotional logic everyone expected. There's a problem, Elena said quietly. If you use her as cover, she becomes part of this. The moment something goes wrong, the people watching you will assume she's involved. You're putting her in danger just by mentioning her name. Carlos felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders. Carmen, who'd never asked for anything more than his company over evening coffee. Carmen, who taught children their numbers and letters and believed the world could be improved through patience and kindness. He was about to make her a target simply by caring about her. But the alternative was leaving his family, if they truly lived, in whatever hell had held them for 15 years. How many nights had Maria stared at walls and wondered if he was even looking for them? How many birthdays had Sofia spent believing her father had simply accepted her death and moved on? I'll protect her, he said, the promise feeling inadequate even as he spoke it. You can't protect everyone, Carlos. That's the lesson you never learned. Elena moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The reason your family was taken wasn't random chance. It was punishment. Specifically for you. Specifically because you were too good at your job and made someone very powerful very afraid. What are you talking about? The Cali cartel didn't just want Escobar dead. They wanted his entire organization dismantled, his key people eliminated or neutralized. But you disappeared before they could find you. So they took the next best thing. Elena's eyes held no comfort. Your family became leverage. Insurance to keep Carlos Mendoza, the most dangerous bodyguard in Colombia, from seeking revenge. The words hit him like physical blows. 15 years of guilt, of believing he'd failed to protect them, and the truth was worse than failure. He'd been the reason they were targeted in the first place. His skills, his reputation, his loyalty to Escobar had painted targets on the backs of the two people he'd loved most in the world. They're alive because I stayed hidden, he said, understanding dawning like nausea in his stomach. And they'll stay alive as long as you remain Carlos the bartender instead of Carlos the killer. Elena touched his arm again, gentle this time, but remaining hidden means accepting they'll never be free. Saving them means becoming the man who made them targets in the first place. Outside, the village continued its peaceful rhythm, unaware that war had just been declared in the storage room of their neighborhood cantina. Carlos looked around at the life he'd built from grief and good intentions, knowing he was about to burn it all down for a chance, just a chance, at redemption. The choice, when it came, felt like stepping off a cliff. Midnight, he told Elena. The mining road. Carlos Mendoza was going home to his ghosts. The ordeal begins. The first test came immediately. Carlos stepped out of the storage room to find Carmen standing in his cantina, her dark hair damp from the evening mist, a concerned expression creasing her forehead. She held a covered plate that smelled of rice and plantains, the kind of gesture she'd made dozens of times before, but never when he needed so desperately to appear normal. "Vicente said you seemed upset earlier," she said, setting the plate on the bar. "I thought you might not have eaten." Carlos felt the familiar warmth of her presence war, with the cold calculation now running through his mind. Every word, every expression, every kindness could be part of the elaborate theater Elena had described. Or Carmen could be exactly what she'd always seemed, a gentle woman extending simple human compassion to a man she'd grown to care for. The terrible truth was that it no longer mattered. He was about to use her either way. Carmen. He moved closer, letting genuine emotion bleed into his voice. The 15 years of loneliness, the growing feelings he'd tried to suppress, the desperate hope that had just awakened in his chest. "I need to tell you something." She tilted her head, and Carlos caught the subtle shift in her posture, the way her weight settled on her back foot, creating distance while maintaining the appearance of intimacy. It was a movement he recognized from 100 potential threats during his years protecting Escobar, the unconscious preparation for flight or fight that marked someone trained to recognize danger. Or perhaps he was seeing threats everywhere now, his paranoia reawakened along with his buried instincts. "Your mother's surgery," he continued, pulling the envelope of emergency cash from his pocket. "Let me help." Carmen's eyes widened, then narrowed with something that might have been suspicion or simple surprise. "Carlos, that's too generous. We barely know." "I know enough." He stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the faint scent of jasmine from her garden. "I care about you, Carmen, more than I should, more than is probably wise. Let me do this." The words felt true even as he spoke them as lies. That was the cruelest part. His feelings for Carmen were real, which made exploiting them feel like another kind of betrayal. He thought of Maria, of the photograph pressed against his chest, and wondered what she would think of him using another woman's kindness to facilitate their rescue. Carmen took the envelope with trembling fingers. "This is too much money for—" She stopped, her face paling as she felt the thickness of the bills. "Carlos, where did this come from?" "Savings. Tips from grateful customers. Does it matter?" But her expression said it did matter, very much. Carmen was staring at him like she'd never seen him before, and Carlos realized with growing dread that he was failing his first test as a man with secrets to hide. The bartender she knew would never have possessed this kind of money, would never have spoken with this kind of authority, would never have moved with the fluid, predatory grace that 15 years of village life hadn't quite managed to erase. "You're leaving," she said quietly. "This is goodbye money." Carlos felt the moment balance on a knife's edge. One wrong word and Carmen might ask the kind of questions that would bring Vicente running, might probe deep enough to uncover Elena's presence or the impossible truth about his family. But honesty felt just as dangerous. How much of his story could he reveal without putting her in the crossfire he was about to walk into? "A few days in Medellin," he said carefully. "Business to settle, old debts. What kind of business requires that much cash?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Carmen's eyes held a sharpness Carlos had never noticed before. Intelligence, yes, but something more focused. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up even as he told himself he was imagining threats where none existed. From the storage room came a soft thump, barely audible but enough to make Carmen's head turn slightly toward the sound. Carlos moved without thinking, positioning himself between her and the door, his body creating a barrier that looked casual but felt anything but. "Rats," he said, the same lie he'd offered Vicente. "Been meaning to set traps." Carmen's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Awful lot of rats tonight." The echo of Vicente's exact words sent ice through Carlos's veins. He studied Carmen's face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint that she was something other than the village schoolteacher who'd slowly captured his wounded heart. But her expression revealed nothing except growing concern and a wariness that could be explained by his increasingly strange behavior. "I should go," she said, backing toward the door. "Thank you for the help with Mama's surgery. We won't forget this kindness." She left quickly, the door swinging shut with unusual force. Carlos stood alone in his cantina, surrounded by the familiar shapes of bottles and glasses, feeling like a stranger in his own life. Through the window, he watched Carmen hurry toward the village center, her pace just slightly too fast for someone simply heading home. 15 years of peace had just ended, and Carlos Mendoza wasn't sure who he could trust in the war about to begin. Carlos watched Carmen disappear into the darkness, then moved quickly to the storage room where Elena waited. But when he opened the door, his blood turned to ice. The room was empty. Only a few drops of blood on the concrete floor proved she'd been there at all. The ropes he'd cut lay in a neat coil beside a piece of paper torn from his inventory notebook. In Elena's careful handwriting, "They know. Run." Before Carlos could process the implications, he heard the rumble of vehicles approaching. Too many engines, moving too fast for normal village traffic. Through the cantina's front window, he saw headlights cutting through the mountain mist like predatory eyes. His 15 years of hiding were over. Carlos grabbed his emergency cash and the old service weapon he'd hidden beneath the loose floorboard behind the bar. The Beretta felt foreign in his hand after so many years of holding nothing more dangerous than a bottle opener. His movements felt clumsy, unpracticed, the muscle memory of violence dulled by too many peaceful nights. The vehicle stopped just outside, car doors slammed with military precision. Through the window, Carlos counted at least 6 figures in tactical gear, moving with the coordinated efficiency of professional soldiers. These weren't local police or even cartel sicarios. This was something bigger, more dangerous, the kind of resources Elena had warned him about. A voice called out, amplified by a megaphone, "Carlos Mendoza, we know you're inside. We also know about your visitor. Come out with your hands visible and nobody else needs to get hurt." The threat was clear. They had Elena, and probably others. Carlos thought of Carmen's strange behavior, her too quick exit, and felt sick. Had she been reporting to them all along? Had his 15-year romance with the village schoolteacher been nothing more than elaborate surveillance? "You have 30 seconds, the voice continued. "Then we start with the neighbors." Through his back window, Carlos could see lights coming on in houses throughout the village. Curious faces appeared at windows, then quickly disappeared as the residents realized something serious was happening. These people had sheltered him, accepted him, treated him like family. Now his past was about to destroy their peace. 20 seconds. Carlos moved toward the front door, then stopped. On the bar where Carmen had placed her dinner offering sat something that hadn't been there before. A small music box, its lid open, the familiar melody of Fur Elise playing softly in the darkness. His daughter's locket lay beside it. The world tilted. Elena had claimed to carry these items, had used them to prove her connection to his family. Now they sat abandoned on his bar like evidence at a crime scene. Either Elena had dropped them in her escape, or 10 seconds. The terrible possibility crashed over him. Elena hadn't escaped. She'd been taken, and everything she'd told him, about his family being alive, about their captors, about the elaborate conspiracy that had hidden them for 15 years, might have been lies designed to flush him out of hiding. "Time's up, Carlos." The cantina's front window exploded inward as a flashbang grenade rolled across the floor. Carlos dove behind the bar as the world erupted in blinding light and deafening sound. His vision went white, his hearing replaced by a high-pitched whine that seemed to split his skull. Boots crashed through the doorway, shouts in Spanish and English, professional voices calling out tactical positions. Carlos tried to raise his weapon, but his hands shook uncontrollably, his body betraying him when he needed it most. Something struck him hard across the back of his head. He went down face first on the cantina floor he'd mopped 1,000 times, tasting blood and concrete dust. Rough hands zip-tied his wrists behind his back. "Clear!" someone shouted. As Carlos's vision slowly returned, he found himself staring up at a face he recognized from nightmares. Colonel Miguel Santos, formerly of Colombian military intelligence, now apparently working for whoever had orchestrated this elaborate trap. "Hello, Carlos," Santos said. his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd finally cornered his prey. "It's been a long time." Carlos tried to speak but only managed to croak. Santos smiled and gestured for his men to haul Carlos to his feet. "Your family sends their regards," Santos continued conversationally. "Maria especially. She's quite eager to see you again after all these years. Though I should mention, she's not exactly the woman you remember." The casual cruelty in those words hit Carlos harder than any physical blow. His family was alive, but 15 years in captivity had changed them in ways he couldn't imagine. And now, instead of rescuing them, he'd walked straight into the same trap. "Elena?" Carlos managed to whisper. Santos chuckled. "There is no Elena, my friend. There never was. Just a very talented actress and an old man's desperate hope." As they dragged him toward the vehicles, Carlos caught a glimpse of his neighbors watching from their windows, faces filled with shock, betrayal, and fear. The peaceful life he'd built was burning down around him, and he hadn't saved anyone. He'd lost everything, and the war had just begun.